Welcome back to First Look Asia. We return to our top story this morning. The UN Agency for Weather and Climate says it's getting hotter and it's going to stay that way.
The World Meteorological Organization adds that climate change is advancing at a rate which is alarming, unprecedented and relentless. Now, here in Southeast Asia, countries like Singapore and Malaysia are already facing exceptionally high temperatures, particularly in recent weeks.
Malaysia has experienced a high of 39.2 degrees Celsius, and schools in the northern states of Kedah and Perlis are closed on Tuesday and Wednesday because of the heat wave.
Now, more schools could close if the temperatures remain that high. In our studio today, we're very fortunate to have Associate Professor of Exercise Physiology, Fabian Lim, from the National Technological University in Singapore to discuss this heat wave and the implications. Professor, thank you for coming in today to our studio. Could you set the context for us and explain to us from a physiological point of view, what is a heat wave? What does it do to us?
Yeah. Well, a heat wave is actually a description of an environmental condition, and it's actually a prolonged period when there's an increase of environmental temperature higher than normal. And the international community has come to agree that when the maximum daily temperature is higher by 5 degrees Celsius than what you would normally experience for consecutively for 5 days, then that will be classified as a heat wave. The impact of that, of course, is that more people will be exposed to heat stroke.
And what is heat stroke exactly? What happens to us when we suffer from that?
Right. So there are different forms of heat injuries, and heat stroke is the form of heat injury that can be fatal. It affects the different organs. It can destroy the different organs in the body, and ultimately affects the way the brain regulates the body. And in extreme cases, you can go into a coma or even death. So this is very fatal.
Now, Prof, is it just about the temperature, though? Or are there other conditions, you know, like the humidity, the things like that, the air pressure?
Yeah, that's a good question, because a lot of us just look at temperature, but actually humidity is the other big factor. And in a heat wave, along with the temperature, there's also an increase in humidity. Actually, our main source of heat dissipation to the environment is through sweating. And it's not just by sweating alone. The sweat has to evaporate. And when there's high humidity, that impedes the evaporation of sweat. And it actually stops the body from removing heat. And that leads to accumulation of heat within the body, eventually to a state where it triggers a heat stroke.
And who is more prone to a heat stroke? You know, we often hear about the vulnerable groups, so the elderly and children. Is that the case here?
In a heat wave condition, the biggest casualty would be the elderly with chronic disease, those who are frail. And that's because the hypothermic state, the high body temperature itself, stresses the physiological systems in the body and also compromises the way the brain regulates how our body functions. And people with chronic disease and who are older usually falls prey to heat stroke in combination with the condition that they have.
Now, Prof, you've mentioned the brain a couple of times now. So that is the key, you know, regulator, if you like, of the body systems. What happens when someone is suffering from heat stroke? You know, what are the signs, the visible signs?
Right. So the early signs may be drowsiness and nausea. And as the condition progresses, the person can become incoherent. They may be muttering things that do not make sense. They can lose mental orientation. They become lost. They do not know their direction. They do not know why they are there. And then they can lose consciousness. They can even lose control of their bowels and bladder.
So the person themselves may not be aware of what is happening.
Yeah.
And
how can we protect ourselves? Because often people pick up isotonic drinks, they, you know, they drink more water. Is that one way?
Well, there's actually a misunderstanding that water prevents heat stroke. Drinking water is essential, but that prevents dehydration. But when you're well hydrated, it doesn't mean that you're protected from heat stroke, because they are actually quite different conditions. The things to do, well, in a heat wave condition, is to reduce the physical activity only to those that are essential. And the fan doesn't help in a heat wave condition because the temperature of the air is warmer than the skin. So when you blow warm air against the skin, you're actually receiving heat from the environment. So the things to do in a heat wave, firstly, is to seek places where there's air condition. That's the best way to protect yourself. If you don't have air conditioner at home, go shopping, have a drink in a cafeteria, go watch a movie or so. You don't have access to those, take a dip in swimming pool if you have access to that. The other things to do would be to take cold shower more frequently, sponging with ice water. These are the common things that we
Well,
would
we're certainly
advise
glad
people
to
do.
have you, Professor Fabian Lim, in our studio today because
you.
we do have air conditioning in our studio. So
Yes.
thank you very much.